On a rainy night when I was 15, my father threw me out of the house and called me a sick child. He had no idea that just a few hours later, that very decision would nearly cost me my life, and would also set me on the path that 13 years later would bring me back to stand before my entire family as someone they never could have imagined. My name is Olivia Sterling. I'm 28 now, but there is one night from 13 years ago that still lives inside me as if it were yesterday. It was a stormy night in October when I was only 15. My father looked me straight in the eye, his voice ice cold, and said the words I still cannot forget. He told me to get out of his house because he didn't need a sick daughter like me. With that single sentence, my whole world collapsed. I stood there, trembling, unable to understand how things had spiraled so far out of control. The only reason was Madison, my younger sister, who had told a carefully calculated lie. A lie poisonous enough for my parents to believe without hesitation, and powerful enough to erase me from the family in a single evening. I had always thought I was used to being overlooked at home, but I had never imagined there would come a day when I would be thrown out into a storm like some useless thing. I was soaked to the bone with nowhere to go and no one to call. And the worst part was, not the rain slashing across my face, but the feeling that the very people who were supposed to protect me had cast me aside. At the time, I had no idea that just a few hours later their phone would ring with a call from the hospital. And when my father stepped into my hospital room and saw the woman sitting beside my bed, his hands began to shake uncontrollably. That night nearly killed me, but it was also the night that opened the door to a new life. After being thrown out, I wandered through the rain like someone with no direction left. The cold water soaked through my coat, my shoes, every layer of clothing, but it still wasn't as cold as the emptiness inside me. I kept telling myself that I just needed to get away from that house, as far away as possible. I called a few friends, but no one answered. It was Friday night. Everyone was at home safe with their families. I was the only one with nowhere to return to. I planned to make my way to the bus station and take shelter there for a while, but the rain was coming down so hard that I could barely see. At an intersection, through the howling wind and the glare of headlights cutting through the sheet of rain, I heard a car horn and the screech of brakes. I tried to step back, but it was too late. The impact threw me onto the road, and my head slammed against the cold, wet asphalt. The pain tore through every thought in my mind. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. All I could hear was the rain and the sound of a woman rushing toward me in panic. She gently held my shoulders, told me not to move, and kept asking my name. With broken breaths, I tried to tell her that my parents didn't want me anymore. I remember exactly how her face changed in that moment, from shock to stunned silence to deep pain. That woman was Dr. Eleanor Smith. She called an ambulance, rode with me to the hospital, and never left my side. If she had not stopped for me that night, my story might have ended there on that freezing road. But she did stop. She saw me. And that saved my life, both literally and in every other way that mattered. 13 years after that rainy night, I stood backstage in a packed auditorium, dressed in a tailored suit, holding a speech with my name printed clearly in the program, Olivia Sterling, director of the Second Chances Scholarship Foundation. The irony was impossible to miss. The place I was about to step onto the stage was the very university where Madison had graduated. My sister had no idea that the keynote speaker was me. My parents didn't know either. They had come to celebrate Madison, to take pride in their perfect child, never suspecting that the daughter they had once erased from their lives would appear before them in a role they could never have imagined. As I looked out at the audience from behind the curtain, my heart pounded, but not from fear. It was the feeling of closing a circle that had been left open for far too long. I was not there for revenge. I was there to tell the truth, the one thing that had been taken from me when I was 15. I thought of the girl I had been back then, drenched, trembling, and being called a sick child. And I thought of the woman I had become, educated, accomplished, driven by purpose, and surrounded by a family I had chosen for myself. When my name was announced, the room responded with polite applause. Madison clapped too until she looked up and recognized me. Her face froze. At first, my parents didn't understand what was happening. But the moment I spoke my first words, they knew. I saw my father jolt upright. I saw my mother press a hand to her chest. And in that instant, I knew something had changed forever. This time I was no longer the child begging to be believed. This time I was the one holding the microphone, the one with the power to tell my own story. The truth is, being cast out did not begin on that stormy night. It had started long before, when I was still a child and slowly began to understand that in that house, Madison's tears always mattered more than any of my efforts. I remember when I was 11 years old, I won first place in a regional science fair with a water filtration project I had spent weeks building. I ran home, clutching my blue ribbon, my heart racing with excitement. I burst into the kitchen, shouting that I had won. My mother hugged me and smiled, and for one brief moment, I thought that maybe finally I had been seen. But then Madison came in after dance practice, her eyes red and swollen, sobbing because she had messed up a turn and the other girls had laughed at her. My mother's arms left me immediately. She dropped to her knees to comfort Madison, while I stood there, still holding my ribbon, as if my joy had been erased from the room in an instant. No one asked what I had done to win. No one looked at my project. No one remembered the award anymore. And it wasn't a one-time thing. It happened over and over again until it became the rule. I learned how to celebrate quietly, succeed quietly, exist quietly. In my house, Madison was always the center of attention because she was more fragile, more sensitive, needed more care. And me, I was always expected to be more mature, more understanding, more willing to give things up. Over time, I was not just overshadowed. I was taught to make myself smaller, to shrink down, until I could fit into the tiny space my family had left for me. As I got a little older, I began to understand that no matter how hard I worked, my achievements would never compete with Madison's crises. By the time I was 14, I had almost stopped bringing home my report cards to show anyone. A row of straight A's on paper meant nothing in a house where one B on Madison's test was enough to make the entire world revolve around her. Once I earned a full scholarship to attend a prestigious summer science program where I would have the chance to study with real researchers. I was so excited, I could barely sleep the night before I told my parents. But the moment I finished speaking, Madison burst into tears, saying it was unfair that I got to go away while she didn't. My mother immediately turned to me and gently suggested that maybe I should stay home that year because Madison needed me. My father agreed, calling it keeping peace in the family. So I gave up that opportunity. By then, I was used to sacrificing. I was used to being told to be the better person, the more understanding one, until I started to believe it myself that my needs should always come second. But deep down, every time I stepped aside, it left a scratch. I kept shrinking inside my own life, as if my value existed only in making other people comfortable. If you have ever had to keep giving up your share just to preserve peace in an unfair family, leave a comment with the number 1. I understand that feeling more deeply than most. Back then, I didn't know that every time I stepped back, I was teaching Madison that she could keep moving forward even if it meant stepping on me to do it. Madison's lies did not explode all at once. They started small, almost trivial, the kind of things outsiders might dismiss as nothing. But that was exactly what made them dangerous. Those small lies let her test everyone's limits. At first, it was little things. She would take something of mine, and then deny it. I would see my sweater on her bed, but when I mentioned it, Madison would blink innocently and say she had never touched it. My mother would sigh and tell me not to start trouble. Then money went missing from my mother's wallet. $50 was not a huge amount, but it was enough to create a culprit. Madison said she had seen me near my mother's purse that morning. I had not done that at all. I had left early for school that day. But my father called me into his study and looked at me as if he already knew the answer. When I said I had not taken it, he simply said in a cold voice, "Madison says you did." And when I tried to say that she was lying, he immediately got angry. He cut me off and told me not to blame my sister. My phone was taken away and I was told not to mention the science program the following year because they couldn't trust me anymore. I still remember the smile on Madison's face from the staircase after my parents walked away. That was the moment I understood the $50 had only been a test. She had just discovered that she could invent a story, place it on my shoulders, and then stand back and watch me be punished without paying any price at all. After that, she became bolder and bolder, while I slowly realized that in that house my truth carried no weight at all. After the incident with the missing money, everything escalated fast. A vase broke. It was my fault. Madison failed a test. It was because I had not helped her enough. Rumors spread at school that Madison had cheated on an exam, and somehow that too was blamed on me as if I had started it. The most frightening part was not just that my sister kept inventing stories. It was how eagerly my parents accepted every accusation without ever checking whether it was true. Every time I tried to explain, they looked at me with that same disappointed expression, as if I were only making their lives harder. Little by little, I stopped defending myself. I was still hurt. I still felt humiliated. But I no longer had the strength to fight a battle whose outcome had already been decided. By the time I was 15, I lived like a shadow in that house, present but invisible, remembered only when someone needed a person to blame. I spent as much time as I could at the library, at school, anywhere that let me delay going home. I told myself that if I could just hold on for 2 more years, I could get into college. I could leave. I could save myself. That was the only plan that kept me going. I clung to it like a final life raft. I believed that if I stayed quiet, if I did not create more conflict, I would survive. But I was wrong. Because people like Madison do not stop when they win, they only learn how to win bigger. I had no idea that the real storm was still ahead. I had no idea that everything I had endured so far was only the opening act for the night that would change my life forever. That fateful week began with something that seemed completely ordinary. A classmate named Jake asked me for help with chemistry. He was not a bad student, he was just terrible at balancing equations and molar ratio calculations. I simply stayed after school with him a few times to explain it. To me, it was nothing more than schoolwork. But to Madison, it was something else entirely. She had been obsessed with Jake for a long time in that intense teenage way, walking past my classroom just to catch a glimpse of him writing her name next to his in her diary. I had seen it by accident once when I was returning a pen to her. One afternoon, Jake stopped me by the lockers, thanked me for helping him the day before, and asked if we could study together at the library for midterms. I said yes without thinking much of it. But when I turned around, I saw Madison standing at the end of the hallway a few yards away. Her face had gone pale, and her eyes were fixed on me. That night at dinner, she barely said a word. And somehow that silence unsettled me more than anything. I had known Madison long enough to understand that when she was not crying, not whining, not making a scene, it usually meant she was thinking of something far more dangerous. A few days earlier, I had met a guest speaker in my biology class, Dr. Eleanor Smith. She spoke about educational fairness, about students who get left behind. I stayed after class to ask her a few more questions, and she handed me her business card, telling me not to let anyone dim the light inside me. At the time, I thought it was simply a beautiful piece of encouragement. I had no idea that just 1 week later that same woman would be the one to pull me out of the abyss my family had pushed me into. By Friday night, the storm came down hard and fast. Wind slammed against the windows and rain pounded relentlessly on the roof. After dinner, I went upstairs to do my homework, trying to ignore the heavy tension hanging over the house. Around 8 o'clock, I heard Madison crying, not the usual sniffling but loud, frantic sobs carefully calculated to send everyone into panic. My heart sank. A few minutes later, my father shouted for me to come downstairs. When I walked into the living room, Madison was buried in my mother's arms while my father stood by the fireplace, his face flushed red, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. I asked what was going on, and Madison looked up at me, her eyes full of tears. For a split second, so brief I almost thought I had imagined it, I saw that behind those tears was not pain but something cold. Then she held up her phone. On the screen was a screenshot of messages in a group chat. It had my name. My profile picture. But the messages themselves were vicious, cruel things about her, saying she was fake, that she cheated, that she was pathetic for chasing after Jake, that she deserved to be laughed at. I froze. I said it was not me, that someone had to be impersonating my account. But my father would not even let me finish. And Madison was not done. She claimed that I had been trying to steal Jake from her, then pulled up her sleeve to reveal a dark bruise on her arm, saying I had shoved her on the stairs. I had never laid a hand on her. But the moment I said in panic that maybe she had done it to herself just to frame me, the room erupted. All that fake evidence layered on top of years of planted doubt became a complete and final verdict. I saw it instantly. Madison had prepared this carefully. This was not impulsive. This was a staged accusation built to destroy me. I begged my parents to let me explain. I told them I had never sent those messages, never touched Madison, never tried to take anyone away from her. But the more I spoke, the colder my father's face became. He no longer cared about what was true or false. He only wanted the easiest ending, believe Madison, and make me the problem. When I tried again to say that she was lying, my father slammed his hand down on the fireplace mantel and shouted that he had heard enough of my excuses. My mother did not defend me even once. She only looked at me with disappointment and said she thought she had raised me better than this. Then my father said the sentence that still cuts through my memory like a knife. He said there was something wrong with me, that I was sick, and that he did not want to see me for one more second. I stood there in shock. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to stop him, waiting for even the smallest sign that she knew this was insane. But she turned her face away, still holding Madison in her arms. When my father pointed at the door and told me to get out, the rain outside was crashing against the glass. I asked him where I was supposed to go. He said that was no longer his problem. In that moment, I understood that I was not just being thrown out of the house, I was being stripped of my place as their daughter. My hands were shaking as I zipped up my jacket and opened the door. Just before it slammed shut behind me, I looked back through the glass and saw Madison staring at me. She was not crying anymore. She was smiling. If you are still here with me, remember to like the video, not for my pain, but for everyone who has ever had to rebuild themselves after being wounded by the very family that was supposed to love them. That night I stepped into the storm with a shattered heart, not knowing that I was walking straight toward the edge between life and death. The storm outside was even worse than I had imagined. Within seconds of stepping off the porch, I was soaked from head to toe. I froze for a moment, almost as if I were waiting for my father to come after me, waiting for the door to fly open and for everything to be taken back. But nothing happened. So I started walking, with nowhere to go, except away from the place that had just rejected me. I tried calling Sarah, then Jessica, but no one answered, or the calls went straight to voicemail. I thought of the library, but when I got there, the doors were locked, the glass dark and lifeless. The bus station was nearly 2 miles away, and it was the only place I could think of. So I kept walking through the wind and rising water my soaked shoes, making heavy squishing sounds with every step. I was so cold that my teeth were chattering, but the deepest numbness was in my mind. I started to wonder if my father had been right. What if I really was the problem? If I was not, then why had the people who brought me into this world always chosen Madison? Why was it that every single time, without exception, my truth lost to her tears? When you are denied long enough, you begin to doubt your own memories and your own worth. I did too. At the intersection, I remember the light being green, but the rain was so thick, the wind so fierce that everything blurred together. Then suddenly headlights tore through the wall of water. A horn, screeching brakes. A violent impact threw me sideways. I remember my body hitting the hood of the car before crashing onto the road. My head slammed against the pavement, and the pain exploded through me like something tearing apart. Rainwater rushed into my mouth, my eyes, every sense I had. I could not move. I could not breathe. In that dizzy, broken moment, I truly believed I was about to die. And the most painful part was knowing I might die. Still believing that my family had thrown me away. Through the pounding rain and the rush of blood in my ears, I heard a car door fly open and footsteps running toward me. A woman dropped to her knees beside me. Her voice was panicked, but her hands were steady. She kept telling me not to move, that she was calling an ambulance, that I had to stay with her. I forced my eyes open and saw the face of a dark-haired woman, rain streaming down her cheeks. She asked my name. I struggled to answer. Then she asked for my parents' phone number so she could call them. I remember trying to whisper that they did not want me anymore. That they had just thrown me out. That they said I was sick. I saw her expression change instantly. In her eyes there was shock, anger, and pity all at once. Before I passed out, I had the faint sense that I had seen her somewhere before. Later I found out I had. She was Dr. Eleanor Smith, the guest lecturer who had spoken to my class the week before. It was strange in a way. While my own family had pushed me out into the storm, this near stranger was the only person who stopped, lifted me off the road, and held on to my life until the ambulance arrived. I do not remember much of the ride to the hospital. My memories were broken into fragments by the concussion, the pain, and the wail of the siren. But the first thing I remember when I woke up was the sound of a heart monitor, the harsh glare of fluorescent lights, the smell of antiseptic, and her voice low, firm, speaking to the medical staff about a concussion, the risk of internal bleeding, and the need to keep me under close observation. And I remember one other thing clearly. She said she was not leaving until she knew I was safe. For a child who had just been abandoned by her family, those words were almost impossible to believe. But she kept her promise. I drifted in and out of consciousness in the hospital room and heard familiar voices coming in. My parents had arrived, but they did not appear with the gentle concern I had spent my childhood hoping for. The atmosphere turned tense immediately because of Dr. Eleanor Smith. She introduced herself as the driver who had accidentally hit me, but her voice was cold as steel when she asked why a 15-year-old girl had been wandering alone in the street during a storm. My father awkwardly called it a family matter than a discipline issue. I could not fully open my eyes, but I could hear how furious Dr. Smith was. She repeated his words back to him as if forcing them to hear the cruelty in what they had done. What kind of discipline meant throwing a child out of the house in the middle of a storm? My father tried to take control, saying they were my parents and that they would handle it from here. But Dr. Smith did not back down. She made it very clear that the moment they threw a minor out of the house, it stopped being a private matter. I heard her ask for a social worker. Then I heard a police officer's voice too. My mother started trembling and tried to deny it. Madison was there as well, still playing the victim, claiming that I was making everything up. But Dr. Smith had heard me before I passed out. She knew I was not lying. When I managed to open my eyes, the first thing I saw was her hand resting over mine. Not my father's, not my mother's, hers. I still remember her leaning down and whispering that I was safe. At that moment, the word safe felt so unfamiliar that it almost hurt. But that night, for the first time in my life, an adult stood on my side and questioned the things that should have been questioned long ago. And that alone was enough to change the direction of my life. 3 days later, when I was more fully awake, my parents were no longer there. They stopped by once during the following days, bringing a few clothes and some schoolwork as if this were nothing more than an inconvenient incident. They said they were glad I was alive, but no one apologized, no one asked if I was okay, and no one asked whether I wanted to come home. Madison did not come even once. Dr. Smith, on the other hand, came every day. She brought me books, sat by my bed, and talked to me about school, about college, about futures I had never dared to imagine before. Then a social worker named Rita came to see me. She had kind eyes and a gentle voice. She asked me about my family, about everything that had happened before, about that rainy night. For the first time in my life, I told the whole truth. I told her about Madison's lies, about how my parents always chose her, about being called a sick child, about the feeling of being erased from my own home as if I had never existed. Rita listened carefully and took detailed notes. After that, she told me I had options, that I did not have to go back to the place that had hurt me. I almost laughed in despair, because if I did not go back there, where else could I possibly go? At that very moment, Dr. Smith walked in and said as calmly as if she were offering something ordinary that I could stay with her temporarily or for as long as needed if I wanted to. I looked at her, unable to understand why someone who was almost a stranger would be willing to do something like that for me. She sat down at the edge of my bed, took my hand, and told me that when she was 17, her own family had thrown her out too, and a teacher had saved her life. Now she said she was simply doing the same for me. In that hospital room, I had to choose between going back to the place that saw me as a burden or stepping into something completely new and uncertain. And for the first time, I chose a word I had never dared to choose before: different. 6 months later, I was almost a different person. Still me, still Olivia, but no longer the girl who constantly made herself smaller just to fit inside her family's indifference. Eleanor's home, she insisted, I call her by her first name instead of doctor, was quiet, orderly, filled with books, green plants, and the soft sound of classical music. She gave me a room of my own and told me I could decorate it however I liked. I transferred to a new school and started over in a place where no one knew about Madison, about the stormy night, or about the label of sick my father had stamped onto me. There I was, simply Olivia, hard-working, curious, serious, and for the first time able to breathe without asking permission. Eleanor opened an entirely different world for me. She took me to university lectures, research seminars, and dinner gatherings where people talked about education inequality and the ways a system can either save a child or fail one. She always said that education was freedom, that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take from me if I held onto it tightly enough. I threw myself into studying as a way of proving to myself that I was not broken, not wrong, and not someone who deserved to be discarded. My grades were no longer just achievements, they were evidence. Evidence that my father had been wrong. Evidence that Madison had not been able to define who I was. Evidence that the truth, no matter how long it is buried, still lives in the way a person rises again. Sometimes I still thought about my old family, wondering if they would ever recognize the truth. But the longer I lived in that house, the more I realized that some people may not give you life, yet they can still give you the feeling of belonging. And sometimes that is the very thing that saves a person. By the time I reached my final year of high school, I was no longer just thinking about escaping the past. I was thinking about turning it into something meaningful. I applied to college with a clear goal to study education policy and social equity, so I could understand why some children are supported, while others are neglected so deeply that they nearly lose their lives the way I almost did. I received a full scholarship to a prestigious university. Eleanor's recommendation letter was so glowing that I cried when I read it. In college, I studied as if every class were another piece of the puzzle, helping me understand my own life. I learned about systems psychology and the gaps that so many students fall into when both their families and society turn their backs on them. During the summers, I interned with nonprofit organizations. I learned how to write grant proposals, how to turn a compassionate idea into a real program that could actually save lives. After graduation, I worked as a research coordinator. Then at 25, I came up with the idea of creating a scholarship foundation for students from broken homes. Students who had been abandoned, abused, or pushed out the way I once was. I called it Second Chances because that was exactly what had saved my life. Eleanor helped me draft the proposal, connect with sponsors, and polish every small detail. We started with one school, then 2, then 5. By the time I was 27, the foundation had awarded more than $200,000 in scholarships to 47 students. Every application we approved was a reminder that my pain had not been meaningless. I could not change my own past, but I could help make sure that other children would not have to walk through the storm alone the way I once did. Then one day my colleague David knocked on my office door and told me I was being considered as the keynote speaker for a graduation ceremony. The moment he said the school's name, my heart skipped. Riverside State University. Madison School. My sister was set to graduate there that spring. I sat in silence for a long moment. David asked if I wanted him to decline on my behalf. For many people, walking away would probably have been the easiest choice. But for me, the question was not simply whether I wanted to see them again. It was whether I was strong enough to close a chapter of my life by standing face to face with my past. I asked what the ceremony's theme was. David said it was resilience and fairness in education. The university president wanted me because my work embodied that spirit completely. That evening, I told Eleanor everything. I said my parents probably had no idea what had become of me. Maybe they thought I was dead, living on the streets, or had simply disappeared somewhere. I told her I did not want revenge, but I did want the truth to be spoken by the very person they had once erased. Eleanor placed her hand over mine and said that if I was going to do it, I should do it on my own terms. No anger, no begging, no bowing my head, only the truth. The next morning, I called David back and accepted. From that moment on, I knew I was stepping into a confrontation not with them first, but with the older version of myself. The 15-year-old girl who had once been thrown out needed to see that one day we would come back, not to ask for recognition but to claim our own worth with our heads held high. I spent 2 weeks writing the speech. I revised every sentence, cutting anything that sounded bitter, and keeping only what felt most honest. Eleanor advised me not to mention anyone by name. Just tell the story, she said, and anyone who needed to understand would understand. The speech began with statistics about inequality in education, about students left behind because of their family circumstances. Then I moved into my own story. A 15-year-old girl being told that she did not belong in the one place that should have been home, being told that there was something wrong with her, and then being pushed out into the middle of a storm. I practiced over and over in front of the mirror, teaching myself how to keep my voice steady, no shaking, no breaking. I did not want to stand there as a victim asking for pity. I wanted to stand there as someone who had survived, who had rebuilt herself, and who was now using that experience to create a path for others. The night before the ceremony, I barely slept. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering the words, sick child, remembering the slam of the door, the freezing pavement, the headlights cutting through the rain. Eleanor brought tea into my room and sat by my bed, just as she had done so many times while I was growing up with her. She reminded me that I was no longer the girl who had been thrown away. I was a woman who had rebuilt her own life. The next morning, I put on a navy blue suit, fastened the pearl necklace she had given me, and looked at myself in the mirror. I saw someone composed, accomplished, and nothing like the frightened child I had once been. And that was what gave me strength. I was not going there to ask them to acknowledge me. I was going to prove that they had not destroyed me. When I stepped onto the stage and heard my name echo through the auditorium, the room filled with polite applause. I saw Madison in the student section, smiling and clapping on reflex, until she realized that the person walking out was me. Her face froze. A few rows behind her, my parents did not recognize me at first either. But the moment I spoke my first words, both of them went completely still. I stood at the microphone, looked out at the sea of faces, and began telling the story of a 15-year-old girl who had once been told she was not worth keeping. I told them how that girl had been thrown out into a storm, left wandering without money, without shelter, and then struck by a car, nearly losing her life. I told them that one person had seen potential in her when everyone else saw only trouble, and that person had become her real family. Then I paused and said, "That girl was me." The auditorium went silent. I saw my father jerk halfway to his feet before dropping back into his seat. I saw my mother clutch her chest, tears streaming down her face. I saw Madison lower her head as the people around her began whispering, piecing the truth together for themselves. I did not shout. I did not attack. I did not call anyone out by name. I simply said that family is not always defined by blood. Sometimes family is the person who chooses to stay when everyone else turns away. I thanked Eleanor right there on stage and said that my scholarship foundation had been born from that experience of being rejected. And when I ended with this thought that a person's worth is not determined by who stays but by who they become after being left behind, the entire auditorium rose to its feet in applause. Not because they pitied me, but because for the first time my story had been spoken in the light, unbroken, unwarped, and no longer silenced. After the ceremony, my parents and Madison stopped me by the side exit. They looked much older than they had in the photos I had once happened to see online. My mother was crying. My father's voice trembled. Madison's eyes were red. They apologized. They said they had been wrong. They said they wanted to make things right. But as I stood there looking at them, I realized that some things can no longer be repaired. An apology cannot give me back my 15-year-old self. It cannot erase the storm. It cannot erase the words, "sick child." It cannot erase the years I spent believing I was unworthy of love. I told them very calmly that yes, an apology is a beginning, but it is not a doorway back in. When Madison said she had only been 12 at the time and had been stupid, I told her that being 12 might explain one lie, but it could not justify 13 years of continuing to erase me from the truth. I told her I forgave her, but not in order to rebuild a relationship. I forgave her so that I could finally be at peace. And I made it clear that I did not want contact. That boundary had cost me a great deal of pain to learn, and I would not betray myself again just to make other people comfortable. After that day, my speech spread far and wide. The scholarship foundation grew stronger, more schools joined us, and more students were pulled back from the edge. I kept living, working, loving, and building a life of my own beside Eleanor, the woman who did not give birth to me, but who chose me every single day for 13 years. I came to understand that forgiveness is not the same thing as reconciliation. I came to understand that blood alone does not make a family. And most of all, I came to understand that real success is not about proving someone wrong, it is about turning your wounds into something that can help heal others. My story ends here, but maybe someone out there is still standing in the middle of their own storm. If this story spoke to you, subscribe to the channel so you do not miss the next ones, because another story might be exactly what you need at exactly the right moment. You deserve to be heard, to be believed, and to be chosen.